Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our call today. Today we've got a very timely subject, which is developing rural community resilience. As we speak, Hurricane Maria has landed on Puerto Rico's shores as a Category 5 with 175-mile-per-hour winds. This is a community that there are many rural communities in Puerto Rico that are currently really impacted by Hurricane Irma, and now they've got another hit coming. So we're thinking about the safety and health of those communities and really hoping that that they're going to be able to bear through this storm. It's really scary, 175-mile-an-hour winds. So, okay, great. Okay, so as I was saying, the events Irma and Harvey alone, it is predicted that they've cost over $190 billion. Many rural communities in Texas and Louisiana and Florida have been impacted, as well as Georgia and the Carolinas, and the USVI have been impacted by these events. And so we wanted to talk today about how you can best prepare yourselves for storms and emergency climate events, but also how to think about building the resilience of your communities as you go forward in a future with uncertain climate vulnerability. We have over 100 attendees on the call today, coming from all over the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii, of course. We've got attendees that are representing small and mid-sized cities, as well as housing organizations, both large and small. We've got housing owners of a variety of sizes. We've got representatives from mobile home parks, from very small rural towns around the country. So we're really excited to be with you all today. And so some of the goals of today's call are you're going to be able to walk away with a better understanding of how to prepare your houses and your communities for emergency events. We're going to share with you some tools to help you figure out how to support your housing and community planning, both financial as well as program tools. And we're going to also hear from our partner Steve Kirk down in Florida from Rural Neighborhoods organization about what they've been doing after the recent events and what their top 10 tips on preparedness are going to be. And then we're going to open up for a discussion on what some of your questions are and some lessons learned that you could share with our community. We're going to close about 3:15. So just to give everyone a perspective from our end, what Enterprise is a national housing organization. We work with lots of communities around the country in three ways. We deploy capital to support community needs by providing grants and funding. We also provide underwriting for low-income housing through that low-income housing tax credit. We also support programs, so we'll provide technical assistance to communities around the country in 10 markets where we operate offices. We have a very special initiative on rural communities where we speak and work closely with partners like Steve on rural housing concerns and concerns of homelessness, and we work closely with tribal communities around the country under the Rural Initiative. And we also support policy that's responsive to the needs of communities around the country. So we have a very strong focus on the needs of tribal communities as well as rural community housing. And so Enterprise has been in place for about 34 years, responding to needs all over the country. And resilience and emergencies are certainly a need that we are looking at really focusing on and have been focusing on for many years. So just to kind of get everyone on the same page with some of the challenges we've seen in working with rural communities around disasters over the last 30 years. Some of the challenges that rural communities face, as you all know, include isolation for many community members and a longer response time for emergency support and first responders. In large part, some of that is informed by lower amount of resources to support first responders in communities that are rural. And so when you have housing and community members that are living isolated from one another, that can be a very big concern when you have a big event, a big climate event or emergency event, and have lower support from first responders. At an emergency level, when there's a disaster that occurs, often that really impacts the economy of the rural community. So many communities are dependent on farming, or one-shop industries or one-shop manufacturing, and when there's an emergency that impacts that particular economic driver, you have a loss of jobs and you have a downturn in the economic profile. So it's a very, very big challenge because that leads to lower resources available. As I mentioned, having lower resources for your first responders. Many rural communities we work with share fire departments or have volunteer fire departments and voluntary fire and EMS. Many rural communities we've worked with use state police. They don't have their own police force. So if there's an emergency, it really requires coordination among other neighboring towns to make sure that you have what you need. Limited funding also means that you have limited resources to house and support your community members after there's an event, so it's important to stay coordinated. These are low-density communities, and so, again, isolation between members, but not a lot of density, so it requires travel to get to particular sites, and you need cars and fuel, and sometimes that's not available in a lot of these communities. Fuel sources might go down, and then you need to have backup. And then, of course, there's communication issues. A lot of rural communities don't have as much access to the internet or to communication channels, so it's really important to figure out how many different channels you can have to make sure that you can stay connected. And oftentimes, many times, the best kind of communication, the best form is person to person. So having a place to go to so you can communicate is really important. And we're going to cover a lot of these topics today and some of the strategies we share with you. I also want to mention the last piece, which is infrastructure. Many rural communities with lower resources are not able to have the kind of infrastructure in place that can withstand a major event. In many communities we've worked with, folks rely on septic and decentralized energy systems to operate. So if one of those goes down, there's not a lot of support always to get that back in place. And so we also know that one of the great assets that rural communities bring to the table is self-reliance as a hallmark of so many rural community members, and that so many rural community members are able to have and design the kind of backup energy and water systems and treatment systems that they need to weather storms. But as we're seeing today, there are a lot of storm events and climate events that are actually creating needs that exceed the resources available to individuals. We know and we've seen in our work that rural communities have incredible tradition of collective support and response, and that these kind of skills and these kind of assets are really what could be a great focus as you're planning your resilience work and your emergency planning work, making sure that you've got those strong relationships in place between people and the organizations that support them and the community, and really support and encourage voluntary leadership in your communities, because that's really an incredible hallmark of so many rural communities. So there are two kinds of disasters really that we're trying to plan for. We're trying to look at predicted disasters to the extent you can predict a tornado or storm 3 days out or a drought. There are certain events that you have some advance notification for. And then there are events that are sudden disasters that you don't have advance notification for. These are a breach of your internet. These could be a mechanical failure. This could be your electricity going down if you've got a centralized grid. This could also be an issue that occurs where maybe your water supply gets compromised. And so these are sudden disasters that you also want to make sure you have a plan in place. Your plan should respond to both disasters. And the idea is if you have a plan in place, you can both minimize damage to your infrastructure at your community. So if your major risks are flooding, you want to make sure you have a plan in place to mitigate flooding, to minimize the damage to your community infrastructure. You want to have your plan in place to minimize damage to your households and your community members, and a plan in place to limit the impact to your business continuity as a small community. This is really limiting the impact to your economic disposition. So you really want to have these three goals in mind when you're planning your emergency plan. And keep in mind, everyone, we're going to have questions at the end and discussion, so please feel free to write your question in the box, and we'll address that later. When Enterprise Community Partners developed a disaster staffing plan, disaster emergency plan tool that is really the basis of our training right now, this tool really looks at building an emergency plan around the idea of having accountable people that are accountable for certain functions of your plan. So the plan that we promote is not a plan that is supposed to lie on a shelf. This plan is centered around having folks in your community appointed for certain roles. This kind of structure is called the Incident Command System. It's used by most first responders as well as FEMA. At the top of this chart, we've got an incident commander. The idea behind the disaster staffing plan as we're presenting it is you've got a charting of folks responsible for different activities, and there's a top-down formation of decision-making, so that there's one person who's in charge of the event, and they have people that are accountable under them for different areas of support. So this can be customized to your community need. If you're a housing organization, this is a really great way we think you can set up your own emergency plan by having this kind of top-down, staff-accountable structure that gets you ready to respond. So at the top of this chart is an incident commander. They're working with an external communications liaison who's helping them with their messaging of the event. Under the incident commander, you've got three major roles, which we call chiefs. You've got someone who's in charge of all of the business continuity of your housing organization. You can adapt it to your community to say under this role, you're going to have someone who's in charge of the business continuity of your city's businesses or business continuity of your actual organization. Next to the business continuity chief, you've got the logistics chief. They're in charge of getting materials and supplies between all of the roles. So this is the person who might coordinate with FEMA to get water to your community, or who might coordinate with Home Depot to get generators out, or maybe coordinate with their local CERT or first responder to coordinate gasoline and fuel. And then next to the logistics chief, you've got the housing chief. Their responsibility is making sure that housing is supported through the disaster, and this could be housing infrastructure, this could also be residents. And so this is very adaptable to whatever your situation and scenario. And we'll show you where the tools are later, but basically the idea here is when you develop your emergency plan, you want to have people on point that are responsible and accountable for certain items. Our toolkit includes materials that will support the role of each of those roles. And each role has a set of items and materials that they'll put into a binder and they'll use to manage out their emergency function. And so we have videos that we make available, as well as guides and tools, which we're going to talk about in a minute, that will actually help you collect the information we believe you need to inform your emergency response. Our emergency plan was actually informed by many organizations that house low-income individuals, and so we feel that what we've got, that we've developed, is responsive to the needs of organizations that work with low-income housing and low-income individuals. As I said, each role has a packet that they're given, and there's a job description in the packet as well as the tools that they need to move forward. The timeline for planning is really, first you need someone who's going to be able to project manage your emergency plan. This is what's called an emergency preparedness coordinator. But this is the person you're going to want to appoint at your housing organization to basically make sure the plan is developed. The first thing they're going to want to do is they're going to want to talk with the executive director at the organization to say who is going to be best fit for each role in our emergency staffing chart. That way they can get the buy-in from their leadership, and then they can move forward and start assigning roles. Then on step 3, they're going to ask each person who's been given a role, whether it's the incident commander or the housing chief, they're going to ask them to customize their job packets, and we'll walk you through a couple tools in a minute. And then after each person customizes their job action packet and works with the emergency preparedness coordinator to really finalize what they're accountable to do, you're going to want to hold what's called a tabletop exercise. And this tabletop exercise is your opportunity to simulate an emergency and drill it. That's a really critical step, because if you don't do that, you don't know if it's going to work. The idea is to get everything you need in place so that when there's an emergency that hits, you at least have your basic staff roles covered and the information you really need to really manage out this crisis. So I'd like to share with you a couple of the tools in this toolkit. We provide you with templates on things like updating your residents on emergencies, or if you're a city manager or calling in from an emergency management agency, you can use this to update your residents, your community members. It's just a chart with all the basic information that we think is important to provide, and you can customize this and then post it. We also have a form that is really important to figure out who's vulnerable, who's the most vulnerable in your community or in your housing organization. So this is a resident survey that is a Word document. You can customize it. It asks questions of the residents so that you can be better informed of the needs of your residents during an emergency. You ask for all the basic information about their phone, their birth date, their email address, if they have any children. You also want to know what their vulnerabilities are with regard to resource needs. Do they need an oxygen tank? Do they have refrigerated medicine needs? Do they have a wheelchair? What do they need in terms of home caregivers? If you have someone living in your facility or in your community that is aging in place, you're going to want to know what their specific needs are, because if you need to evacuate folks and prioritize evacuation, this is an important list for you to keep. I can tell you that I spoke with a colleague yesterday that is in Puerto Rico, and they had to evacuate a building of multifamily housing residents, and they only had space for 10 at a time. And so they actually used something like this to determine who needed to be evacuated quickly to hospitals and who could wait a little bit. So this kind of tool helps you understand your residents a little bit better. And you can add to this as you want, but this is an open tool for you, and it's a Word document. The next tool is a go-back checklist. This is a tool that we created. It's a visual tool. It is something you can hand out to your residents or your community members, and it asks them to think about all the kind of things they need in their go-back. They may need to have extra food. They may need to have an extra light. They may need to have glasses, their medicine, maybe a birth certificate. And so this is an easy, accessible, visual way to get the information across to your community members. And so those are some of the tools that we've actually created. We've got tons of tools in this emergency staffing toolkit that you can use. Again, the idea is to have everything planned out in advance of an event so that you're better able to manage the event, and having staff that's accountable to doing certain things at an event level. The next tool we've developed, which I want to share with you a little bit about, is the strategies tool on infrastructure. And so we're going to turn over to your infrastructure of your community and of your facility. When you're thinking about planning out your housing facility upgrades, or you're thinking about how to stabilize your housing in the event of an emergency, and in the case of this, it's going to be a climate emergency, there's a couple of things you want to do first so you can start making the right decisions. One is identify your hazard exposure. This is where you want to understand what is your exposure to floods, what's your exposure to wind events, what has been your historical exposure, and what is your anticipated exposure. Then you're going to want to assess your risks, the risks to your residents, your housing, and your businesses, as well as your community at large. And then ultimately determine the strategies that you're going to bring in to support the resiliency of your community. And often having hard, concrete infrastructure in place to support your emergency response and to support your resilience, mitigating the impacts from a variety of these climate events, really will go far in protecting your community. So how do you start to think about identifying your hazard risk exposure? There's a couple ways. There's a variety of tools that are available to help you understand what your hazard risk might be. FEMA has a great tool to help you understand your flood risk. You can actually type in your address to a FEMA online database, and they'll tell you what your flood risk and flood exposure is. We also know that a lot of our communities aren't mapped either to floodplains, so it's important for you to understand what your historical exposure is as well, not just going online to find out what your flood map is, but to figure out what your historical exposure is. Then a lot of communities are looking at the exposure from extreme heat and extreme temperature. So it's really important to figure out historically what the hazards of your community have been so you can plan accordingly. And then, of course, with folks living in Tornado Alley or dealing with hurricanes, it's really important to understand your historical past risk exposure. If you have a local agriculture facility that you work with, or if you, an extension rather, or if you have a local university or college that you work with, this is an important thing to consider, maybe asking them to help you model what your risks have been and what you should be thinking about planning for. But many of you on the phone have a very clear idea about what your risks are. And these are anticipated risks. The unanticipated risks are, of course, something that we can't really understand if they're actually an exposure happening tomorrow or 2 weeks from now. So having your emergency systems in place is really critical. I'll also note that another risk might be having certain external events happen that could impact your ability to provide fuel to your community. So, for example, if there's a problem getting fuel shipped to the state or to your region, you end up with a shortage. So it's worth paying attention to the risks of your overall region as well, so you know what to think about as you're planning your resiliency plan. And then, what are the risks to your community? If there's an emergency event, will there be damage to property? What's the economic stress that might occur if there is a major flood, or if there is a major shock of some kind? What would evacuation mean for your community if folks have to evacuate for weeks at a time? In Key West right now, there is predictions that evacuations, folks will be evacuated in and out of their community for upwards of months. So what does that do to the community if community members can't come back? And then, of course, what does a blackout mean? Or if your water supply is contaminated, what does that do for your community? And so thinking about those kind of risks and charting them out is a really great way to start thinking about how to plan your resiliency strategy. And then there's risk to your residents, your buildings, and your business continuity. So all of this can be charted out, and we provide you with some guidance on that, but just thinking about what your weak links are and what you should do to think about fortifying and supporting those weak links. I'll give you another example. We worked with a community that has one road coming into the community. It's on an island, and that road often floods. So when that road floods, if the community members don't have a boat, they can't get off the island. And so that's a weak link to think about. If you have one means of egress in and out of the community, or if there's a calamity with the road itself, that's a big problem. So the solution in that community might be having some community boats available to help folks, or having a mitigation system in place for that road, so that when it floods, you can prevent it from flooding. And so we segment our strategies on resilience in 4 areas. We look at strategies that will actually protect your facility or your community from actual impacts from flooding or extreme temperature. One example of a protective strategy is creating barriers or perimeter barriers that will help support and shield one section of the community from flooding. So this is a case of folks are laying down some riprap and some rocks and boulders to help prevent flooding coming downstream into the community, as well as landslides. So this is one example. You can have shields that you put up or perimeter walls that you erect to ensure that flooding doesn't impede your community, come into your community, but there's a lot of things you can do to actually protect your community. So these are the protective strategies are your classic mitigation strategies. And then we have the strategies that point to the adaptation of your community or your facility. And these are strategies that are basically defined as strategies that allow your facility to adapt to the changing conditions. So whereas mitigation looks at protecting your community from the climate impact and preventing it from actually impacting your facility or your community, these strategies actually allow your facility or your community to slowly adapt to what conditions are coming forward. And so we look at stormwater management techniques as interesting techniques to help you adapt to higher precipitation. And these are just a couple examples of some stormwater management practices, but these are kind of seen as more green infrastructure and more passive type of interventions. The third area we detail in our book, and then we're also, this is a very important strategy area. This is your backup. This is your strategies that will promote your power loss, backing up your power, as well as your potable water. We provide some guidance on how to size your generators, what kind of fuel you should be thinking about, what's most appropriate, how do you operate and maintain generators and backup power. Having a backup power source is critical, specifically for rural communities, because your power lines could go down for weeks at a time due to a variety of issues. The time to get those repaired it's never clear whether it's going to be soon or later. It depends on the ability to get out to your sites. And so having at least a couple generators for the community on hand is really important. Making sure those generators are exercised and there's fuel available is critical. And then vulnerable community members having generators would be really key, especially if they need oxygen or they need some kind of mechanical device. And there's things that you can do like protecting your fuel tanks and having systems in place to make sure that your backup fuel, your backup supplies are protected. If you don't have protection around your backup supplies, what's the use of having them? So folks from around the country have lots of great ideas about how to cheaply and affordably protect a variety of things like food stock, and water, and fuel. We provide some guidance on the types of fuel to think about when you have a generator, but that all needs to be protected and safeguarded. And then the last area we look at is community protection. So this is where we're looking at how to actually protect and encourage the community connection that we mentioned before, the strong ties that so many rural communities have, and really amplify and support and encourage communities coming together and working together to fortify their community and recover and rebuild. And so one of the strategies that we outline is creating community spaces and a community shelter. And there's a whole set of guidance on what the community shelter should have in place. But one thing you want to think about when you're having your community shelter built is you're going to want to make sure that it has the backup it needs, that you have a generator for that shelter. Maybe you want to bring in some water supplies and food stock and have the shelter be sited in an area of the community that is not vulnerable to flooding and wind, that it's specifically fortified. And we'll talk about other ways we can encourage community connectivity, but one way is to promote and encourage communication between residents. And so you can use forums like this that actually, this was actually distributed by the state of Georgia for rural communities, but this is a template for how to promote a public service announcement to your community. It's already been reviewed by a legal authority, so you can write into this template what you need, and then you can send this out. And there's a lot of great online forums that you can use and dig up to promote public service awareness and awareness around an event. I wanted to point everyone to a very interesting tool that I've been using, which is a citizen-based open source tool that allows folks to find their local shelters. So in many rural communities, there is not always a clear sense of where the evacuation shelter is. Folks can sometimes just default to churches or make assumptions that a hospital might be a shelter when in fact it's not. So knowing where your shelter is, your evacuation shelter, is really important. And this is a tool which we can share with everyone afterwards, which really shows where are the shelters in your community, and it's input by citizens, and it's updated by citizens, and this is from Puerto Rico. And so in terms of the community center, it's important to make sure that there's resources in place so folks can actually have power and communications. And we've identified a couple interesting resources that you can use to help support your community connectivity and your community response, handing out OK help signs or handing out walkie-talkies to key members of your community are really important to encourage that kind of community response. And in terms of creating your community center, identifying where it would be, it's always good to recommend a place that is well known to the community and that folks might go to. So it could be in your downtown, if you have a general store, maybe near the general store, if you want to erect a community center. You can also use it and purpose it to do to support a lot of other activities as well, like community meetings and a variety of things. So we like to say if your community center is used all year, people are familiar with it. They're socialized to use it. It's not an outlier. It's a useful, all-purpose center that then gets turned over to an emergency center when there's an emergency. Wanted to just share with you, there's a great program that was started in 2003 called Citizen Corps. It was created to encourage citizens to step forward and become supportive of emergencies. Many of you may know this as the CERT program, but it's a terrific program that teaches you all about community resources and tools, and it's a terrific way to get involved in your community. So this is all great information, you might say, but then how do I deal with the financial burden and expense of an event, an emergency event? And I just wanted to let everyone know, you already probably know this, but in addition to the support that FEMA might provide, and they have funding that's available for emergency assistance, the USDA really has some really terrific programs out there that will help support your emergency needs and emergency needs of your community members after an event. I just want to refer you to a few of these. On the household level, when there's an emergency or disaster declared, the USDA will deploy emergency food stamps. And so that's important for you to know about so that you can get your community members what they need. And WIC will also do the same. There's the Emergency Watershed Program, and this program really helps communities deal with flooding and repairing their watershed after an event. The Equipemnt program helps with cleanup, and there's funding that's available for cleanup of various emergency situations. Many of the communities that we work with do have farming and livestock programs, so there's emergency farm loans that the USDA deploys, as well as programs to help assist with downed trees and trees that are falling. And there's a set aside for farms and livestock, which will help cover a variety of expenses. So having a sense of what's available to your community members before an event in terms of financial support is really important, because the time to find out about these programs is not when there's the emergency. The time to find out about them is before the emergency, so you can quickly respond after the emergency. With all these programs, it's worth making sure that your community members and you have pictures and documentation of your major assets, so that when you go in to get support from any of these programs, you are ready to go with your package, so that you're not waiting until the emergency happens and you have to take pictures of cleanup. A great way to prepare for households to prepare for their emergency response is to document everything they've got regarding assets and any claims you might want to be making before the event. So taking photos of the land, of the livestock, of your farm tools, your equipment, all of this is really key to do before the event. So that's a little bit about, a little bit of information on what we've developed to support your emergency planning, to support your community preparedness, some resources that we want to share. And I want to now turn over to Steve, who's going to be talking with us about some of his recent experiences as a first responder in Florida. Steve Kirk is president of Rural Neighborhoods. He's been there since '94, since Hurricane Andrew, actually. He began his work with migrant and seasonal farm workers in North Carolina in '76, and he received the Lindenhurst Foundation Young Career Prize in '85 for civil rights work on behalf of rural workers in the South. In fact, Steve was appointed by then Governor Jeb Bush to the Florida Hurricane Housing Task Force in 2005, and in 2006 he received the Housing Assistance Council's Award for Community Service. We're really happy to have Steve here. He's literally coming to us from the trenches of Florida, as a first responder, and we're really excited to have you talk us through your lessons learned, Steve. With that, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Steve, your phone may be on mute.
My phone is on mute. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Kirk, as Laurie said. Let me just share a little bit in the beginning about our organization, because we really are, like most of you, online. Rural neighborhoods in many ways exists in its form today because of a single disaster, Hurricane Andrew. We are primarily a rural organization in Florida, so with apologies to those of you in South Dakota and Montana, we are not quite that rural. We're fortunate, like many groups in California and Texas, to be on the edge of metropolitan districts, but we still are, generally speaking, an hour away from an urban center in almost all of our 7 rural communities that we serve. Prior to Hurricane Andrew, we were a small organization that had managed a migrant labor camp in Homestead, Florida City, Florida. And post-Hurricane Andrew, we turned into an organization who had responsibilities for housing development and rebuilding. I joined the organization after Hurricane Andrew, and today, as I said, we're in 7 rural communities. We have a portfolio of approximately 1,700 housing units, and we manage 75% of those units. So we are a relatively narrow organization in terms of housing production. We are not a broad-based organization, as such as some of you may be on the phone who are community action agencies. And so as we begin to talk about disasters, our experience is, generally speaking, in predictable disasters, and specifically in response to hurricanes. And I think just as a thought in terms of beginning this, I think what I'm going to do in terms of sharing our disaster tips are sort of twofold. Our goal as an organization is to preserve and rebuild ourselves, but it is also to rebuild our community. So it is looking both internally as to what we need to do to survive post-disaster, but it is also, more importantly, what we can do to make our community better post-disaster. So my first tip, if we shift to the next slide, that we're going to talk about a little bit is, does your strategic plan today address your role in a disaster? And for those of you who are participating in the Gulf Coast or in Florida or along the eastern seaboard, I think all of us know that we are at risk each hurricane season for a potential hurricane. For those in the Midwest and some of the tornado belt situation, you also know that you are at risk at almost any moment for a tornado. So as a consequence, this is not something that is unpredictable. It's simply a matter of at what time do we have to face that risk head on. 6 weeks ago, when we decided to do this seminar, I certainly didn't expect that we would be facing Hurricane Irma on September 10th. That's the last thing I thought in this situation, but it was always that possibility. So for us, in terms of an organization, and I think for you, the question you need to ask is, what is your appropriate role in a disaster? Is it preparedness for your tenants or your community? Is it relief to them in the aftermath of a storm? Or is it an actor in the course of recovery for your community? It helps focus your efforts, and if you do this with your board of directors in advance, it will give you comfort that the choice you make post-disaster is the right one. There's nothing worse than thinking that we're powerless to deal with relief, when perhaps had you thought about it before the storm, knowing that you had a limited relief capacity may have been the right choice. So rural neighborhoods is explicitly determined in our strategic plan that our relief role is limited. Our lines of business are not service-oriented, but they're housing development-oriented. In that instance, we know that from our strategic plan, our board and senior management understand that our role in the days following the storm is advocacy and coordination. We provide common space to other partners. We bring partners into our communities to provide food assistance and benefit counseling. We don't provide it ourselves. It's not to say that we don't try to be certain that relief reaches our tenants and to the people outside of our housing projects, but we understand that except in exceptional circumstances, we're not in that role. Our chosen role is going to be as an advocate post-disaster, engaged in planning and the rebuilding of our community. Now, in our recent experience in Hurricane Irma, for the past week, we have been engaged in coordinating relief services. We have actually worked with Red Cross, to our local banks, to bring resources to our tenants, and we have, in instances, expended monies to make sure that we had ice and water available to people in certain localities, because we, even today, 10 days post-storm, have no power in some of our rental communities. So it is the strategic plan puts you on a firm basis to know what your role is. And so our first tip is to engage board in a strategic plan for the disaster role. The second part of preparedness, I think, is dealing with training the people that you serve for predictable disasters. Historically, we provide tenant services both from a mission perspective in a limited sense to our residents, and because some of our housing properties have LORA requirements that we provide certain services. One of the services that we've provided for a number of years has been life safety training. And our life safety training is something that we do semi-annual for all of our tenants. And historically, it's covered subjects like fire safety training and CPR. And we've been in a routine where we can get Red Cross in to do CPR training, and we like to do fire safety training because it gives us a chance to teach our tenants how to use fire extinguishers, it gives us a chance to educate them and not, as we all know, not detaching their smoke detectors. But we have recently, in our strategic plan and in our disaster preparedness plan, determined that we're going to be doing hurricane planning each June and July for our tenants in every one of our 22 properties. And that we'll do those materials on an online basis so that as we begin in the immediate approach of a storm or a disaster, point that information out and refer tenants to our website so they can begin to access that information. Why not? I mean, we're looking today post-disaster in which we're in the process of potentially replacing 150 refrigerators due to food spoilage. And the question that we're asking, rather than to incur that nearly $100,000 expense post-storm, can we teach tenants better to prepare for the loss of electricity for an extended period of time, to be able to preserve that asset, and also to be able to do things that will allow them to be more self-sufficient. So certainly incorporating disaster training in your tenant orientation, or in some of your service delivery where you're preparing home buyers and other people in terms of first-time home buyer training, disaster is a piece of that education. From a third perspective, just in terms of preparedness, partnerships matter. We are sometimes good at this in some years, and sometimes we're not so good in this year. But it is important for us to participate in local emergency management meetings, particularly management meetings that include volunteers that are basically VOAD meetings, volunteers after disaster, and your market to maintain the contacts with your local emergency management, Red Cross, and other. If there's VOAD volunteer training, which our jurisdiction has offered at some points in times, we recommend having staff take it. It could make the difference in your community of getting back into a disaster area sooner rather than later, when certified VOAD volunteers may be able to get past checkpoints to get into an area in which commercial business owners, even us as nonprofit organizations, and certainly individual homeowners, can't get back into that area, and everyone is obviously emotionally interested in getting back. But those partnerships are important. I'm going to talk a little bit later on the next slide, which we won't get to yet, about chaos. And one of our tips is to expect chaos. But the participation with Red Cross and with emergency management ahead of time eliminates some of that chaos. As you evacuate communities, having ties to emergency management means that you can get buses to your community to help evacuate people to shelters. It means you can get the most current lists of shelters as they open, fill, and new shelters are opened. And In the meantime, post-storm, you may have the direct contact to Red Cross, and they may know because of your previous participation that you're a ready, available, hardened site for them to provide disaster services. So meet with disaster partners throughout the year. So we begin to move in preparedness, and I think this is something that most of us probably intuitively know, but as the normal workload develops on our doorsteps, we sometimes avoid doing. For us, and I think for those of you in Tornado Alley, there is a bit of a predictable season as to when these risks are going to occur. And so do we, in a sense, inventory and separate our disaster tools and materials? We hope to. We're not always as good as we plan, but we hope to routinely conduct a pre-season inventory of our storm season supplies. That's the best practice, doing that each season. For rural neighborhoods, Hurricane Irma required us to shutter nearly 1,000 housing units out of our 1,700-unit portfolio. Most of the balance had impact windows, but our older properties rely on closing shutters. We can put 1,000 units. We can put shutters on 1,000 apartment units in 72 hours. That is an important drill that protects our tenants and protects our properties. It is not the best moment to launch a run for supplies. No one is perfect in preparation. We certainly aren't. And over 2 decades, our process has gotten good grades and bad grades. Here's one example. In our properties, we once had storm shutters centrally located in some of our maintenance storage area, and we distributed these to the units prior to their need to be put up. We learned quite quickly, this is more than 2 decades ago, that this was a logistical nightmare, sorting materials for the appropriate window units. In our headquarters here in Homestead, Florida City, we actually have a community that arose out of Hurricane Andrew. It's a 120-acre campus. We have 510 family apartments and single-family duplex and townhouse configurations. We have 3 child care centers, 10,000 square foot of neighborhood retail, and we have our own offices and community center. That's a lot of shutters. And so we took the step thoughtfully to now mount materials for each unit in their rental unit storage room. The good news, we can shutter 1,000 units in 72 hours. The good news, tenants are extraordinarily helpful in putting shutters up to protect themselves and to protect their own procedures, which makes that process go extremely quickly. But the bad news is that materials sometimes walk out the door. Pilferage occurs. And so again, you're continually trying to improve your process. So now we include shutter inventory on our move-in, move-out inspections, just as one would do with appliances and other goods. In addition, we build shutter installation kits in 5-gallon buckets where we have drills that get placed in 5-gallon buckets with the appropriate bits. And we don't use those drills in our routine maintenance because come storm time, we would find we don't have enough drills to be able to quickly install shutters and do the things that we need to do. So for each of your properties and for your offices, I think everyone should be urged to maintain a product data sheet, noting the kind of supply specifications that you have in one disaster workbook. It's no different than the insurance toolkit, or the insurance coverage worksheet that Enterprise includes in its toolkit. You want to have all that disaster information in one spot, so as you begin to understand what system of shuttering do we have and what do we need to look up if we do need to have some parts, we have them at our fingertips. And we don't want to be gathering insurances in the 72 hours prior to the storm. We want that information available to us. So maintain disaster supplies and tools and keep them separate from your routine maintenance materials. I think, again, this is probably one of the most important pieces of any disaster, and that is you are the people who work for you. And, again, if we look back to what Laurie discussed before in terms of her incident command chart, you need to have a plan as to what people's responsibilities are. And equally important, you need to have a plan for your staff. Pre-season, it's always important to update emergency phone numbers for your staff, so again, you're not doing that prior to the storm. But as we find in hurricanes, which is obviously a little greater advance notice than one has in other disasters, we're in a situation to begin to rotate our staff out in those 3 to 4 days prior to a storm so they meet their own personal needs. So we've developed a system in which we know that we're going to need staff people up until the last minute in terms of evacuating our tenants or making sure that everything is prepared. But that's impossible to do if you don't enable your own staff to prepare themselves so that they're comfortable being with you at the last moment. And so we will routinely give staff members a morning or an afternoon off to be able to get their storm supplies, water, gas, other types of things that they need, so they are not only available, but emotionally comfortable being available to do the job that we ask them as organizations to do. Now, in our organization, those responsibilities that Laura talked about are relatively easily spread. Our external communications, for example, fall on me as the executive director. Our business continuity tasks, they fall upon our CFO and our IT staff. They're the ones that are going to get us shut down, make sure that our files are backed up, and they're the ones who are going to tell us how to turn our computers and servers and systems on post-hurricane. One of the things that Hurricane Irma did to handicap us is that we were without internet access from Sunday, September 10th to Sunday, September 17th. And although, because of other things we'll discuss in terms of our hardening, we were able to open as an organization, we had a tremendous amount of technology barriers, primarily the fact that our internet providers were not back online. So as much as we protected ourselves in a positive way by having a great deal of our information available in the cloud, we were not able to access much of our rental management software through national providers such as Yardi and OneSite because we simply couldn't get onto the internet. So there's pluses and minuses to this. So I think everyone needs to understand that despite the fact that you've backed yourself up, old-fashioned basic needs about printing out rent rolls and having that information in hand is still important because you may not be fully functional for days and certainly potentially weeks after the disaster. I think there's a plus in having that comes from a human resource perspective of being engaged in a disaster. Our staff today, 10 days later, and many of our staff have worked for the past 10 to 12 consecutive days, are physically exhausted, but they are, I think, mentally and emotionally invigorated. They understand that they have helped countless scores of people in this past week. And though the nature of what we do often puts us in a situation where, if not careful, we begin to dislike those we serve because they don't behave in the way we hope they will, they continue to sometimes bring their partners back in domestic violence situations, and it frustrates us. They miss appointments, etc. There's nothing about almost all of our staff are involved in what we do because they care about people. Disasters give a chance to reinvigorate the staff, and it gives them, reminds them of why they're here. We plan for staff in our disaster by also thinking about their evacuation plans. This particular evacuation, we made units that we have in other parts of our community, particularly some of our clubhouses and leasing offices, as an evaluation option for some of our staff. For those of you who tracked Irma, our entire state at one moment or another was at risk, and so we were actually in a difficult situation in our state knowing where to head. Usually we head to one coast or the other. That was not so simple in this storm. But having our facilities potentially available for people in need on our staff double down on our commitment to them as employees. Next slide. Move to number 6. Tip number 6 is expect chaos. From a pre-storm perspective, we have a lot of template messages that are ready for tenants. It's an adaptable template. It begins with us informing tenants And I think one of the things that we succeeded in doing with Irma, we provided real, unemotional, factual information to our tenants that was not hyped by our local news stations and not hyped by that sort of drama that we all, I think, sometimes get caught up. We have on our staff evidence-driven staff people, and I think, much as everyone else, we have staff who are emotionally driven. We've handed some of the roles in terms of providing information to staff to the people who are evidence-driven, not the people who are emotional-driven, so that we can communicate well with the people we serve. And our early communication, just as Laurie suggested, has a go-bag message in it. It's one of the most important things we can do to the people we serve is to prepare them for the storm, and the go-bag is an important message. Our series of messages, although they're not there in terms of word by word used in every storm, the pattern follows. The first is information. The second becomes an act message. Put up your shutters, help us put up your shutters. And then there's a final action, which is sometimes evacuate or to pull in the things from your porches, etc. But so it isn't a hit the button type of template. It's a template that needs editing. But having that in place does save time, and it does reduce the chaos. As I said before, in Irma, our storm paths were every place we were going to hit it. First it was the East Coast, then it was Central Florida, then it was the West Coast. As I said before, we relocated staff. We relocated staff and then relocated, and we had staff run to our properties in Tampa, which had backup generators for an SRO facility that is seasonal in its use, and people could stay there. Once they got there, the storm shifted, they ran back here. So, as I said, expect the chaos and you just manage it, because shelter information will keep expanding and changing. And I think for those people, in terms of filling in your incident command chart, pick the people who thrive in chaos. That's what you're going to get, but planning is critical to make some order out of it. The Neighborhood Disaster HQ that Laurie talked about towards the end is an important piece, and she talked about infrastructure, understanding hazard exposure, risk assessment, and resilience. Those are the things that we consider in building a neighborhood disaster headquarters. For us, we have a neighborhood disaster headquarters in several of the communities that we serve. At our headquarters, it is our 6,000 square foot community center. It is built above a floodplain. It is it is hardened with very few windows and shuttered windows at that. And we have a backup generator, fuel supplies, both for the generator itself and for our organizational vehicles. It allows us to be back on the ground as quickly after the storm as possible. On Sunday the 10th, most of the shelters allowed people to leave about 8 p.m. on Sunday. On Tuesday morning, 50% of our staff were back at work in our neighborhood disaster headquarters. We had no power in our rental communities, but we had emergency power through our building generators at our headquarters, and we were able to put our maintenance people back on the job, clearing trees, and allowing emergency vehicles or ambulances to get to our site if need be. We had fuel because we were able pre-storm to top off our propane tanks that run our building generators, and we were able to top off our diesel and gas fuel tanks, which we have small diesel and gas fuel tanks that allow us to be able to operate our own trucks and our own tree clearing equipment in that situation. So that is our primary disaster headquarters, and we've repeated that same situation in our northernmost property. We as an organization have properties that range from Miami-Dade County to Lakeland, Winter Haven in the north. We have about a 4-hour travel distance between our various properties. And we have hardened several of our sites with generators, as I mentioned, fuel and propane. We have some pre-storm contracts in place for debris removal. And so we were up and running very quickly. How do you get there? Where does the money come to get there? We have a lot of hardening that we have not done. So we attempt to plan capital improvements that will over time get us there. We are trying to establish a similar situation in the properties, or one or more of the properties between our north and south location, so that we can do that. Tip number 8, again, just trying to let me gain a little bit of time here, is post-storm track expenses. And I haven't thought of a catchy way to say this, but it's also track expenses and maintain your procurement standards. Don't abandon your procurement standards post-storm. If you're like we, at some point you do what you need to do and you spend the money that you need to spend to protect the people in your community and to protect the people that you serve. And to the degree you have the financial wherewithal to do it, you do that not knowing whether you're going to be reimbursed by someone else at some later period of time. We're in that situation today. We're replacing refrigerators. Imagine just this, the numbers sometimes are just little things that get you. We have no power in some units from 8 to 10 days later. As a consequence, we have 4,000 smoke detector batteries that have been beeping for 10 days. They're going to need to be replaced in order to protect the health and safety of our tenants. We've ordered them. Yes, we can potentially get them from replacement reserves. We may be able to get them from other sources, but it's something that's necessary for us to do for people post-storm to be safe and not end up losing their life or being hurt from a subsequent normal disaster like a fire that could occur. So tracking expenses is important because there are people, organizations, governmental and non-governmental, able to help. And one of the most key important things to do in your community, assuming that many of us on the phone are nonprofit organizations, is to learn FEMA public assistance regulations. FEMA public assistance basically says that local government and certain qualified nonprofit organizations have the ability to be reimbursed by FEMA for expenses they incur both pre-storm and post-storm. So if you think about this in a governmental sense, it is often what communities do to set up shelters, to provide emergency food. It's also what local jurisdictions do in terms of debris removal. But nonprofit, essential, and non-essential non-governmental, essential, and non-essential service providers, one of which is nonprofit low-income housing, have the ability to also qualify for public assistance for certain things that they do pre- and post-storm. And so we are hopeful as we begin to, and we once understood these 22 years ago, we thought we had them memorized, but we've forgotten, but is to relearn those public assistance regulations and to begin to make those requests for assistance. Sure.
I'm sorry to jump in. We have a hard stop coming up, so what I'm going to ask
let me just say 2 sentences about the last two. One
absolutely,
yeah. Okay, in terms of expanding and using your partnerships, national groups like Enterprise, LISC, Housing Council, many of our ethnic organizations like the NAACP and LULAC, they're there to help. You should remain in contact with them. And then the last thing is rebuild greater. Put your dreams on paper. Have a vision. For me and for our organization, it's not enough to return our communities to pre-storm conditions. We need to be involved in planning discussions to make our communities better. And getting these things on paper, dreams on paper become more real. So set the goal to not just get back to normal. We want to end up making our communities greater.
Thank you, Steve. And I hate to jump in
that's fine. That's perfect.
We do have a hard stop coming up, so what I'd like to suggest is I'm sure that our attendees have lots of questions. We may not be able to get to them all live, but please go ahead and submit them because when you do, we get your email address along with that, and then we can respond to you after this session has closed. So don't let the time constraint stop you. Please type your question into the Q&A box or the chat box, whichever you feel. We prefer the Q&A. And then, if we have to get to them offline, we certainly will. While folks are typing in their questions, I'm going to turn this back over to Laurie for just a sec.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Steve, and thanks, everyone. We just, we're just learning right now that Puerto Rico has just shut down their power to the island, which is devastating. And so this really points to the issue of you may in your community have certain infrastructure that's vulnerable, or you may, you really need to be coordinated with your region and even at the state level to make sure that there's resources available to you, because there's an interdependency between you and your other towns and your state, and especially when it comes to power and resources like fuel, making sure you have a stock on hand should you need that. And I really want to thank Steve and applaud his efforts around the disaster response, because you really are the firehouse for your community, Steve, and we're so thankful for you doing this and in service to your community.
Oh, you're welcome.
I do have a question that just came in. This is, how long does it take to get a disaster plan together?
It depends on your what you've got in place already, but a basic disaster plan, if you could identify the folks, and as Steve said, if the people are used to risk and used to emergencies, they'll be obvious who that might be. If you've got your information already, it takes less time. We think you can probably get this together for your housing facilities in a month. So if you have everything in place and you have your emergency preparedness person in place, that's a pretty good indicator. And you can also hire that person out. It doesn't have to be an in-house staff person. It can be someone that you bring in to help run this. We provide you with the guidance on setting up that emergency preparedness coordinator scope and role. So we'll provide you with all that information, and we'll be sure to send you the links to all of these tools after this training so you can go ahead. And I just want to ask if anyone has any experiences in the field that you'd like to share with us, anyone on the line, please let us know. We've got a whole audience here that's listening and wanting to learn about other projects and other processes that you all go through. So we'd be open to that.
Great. We have a specifics question here, and that is, are there any methods to salvage appliances during an event?
Well, this is Steve Kirk.
Steve, do you want to go ahead? I have some thoughts on that, but Steve, I'll defer to you first.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd be curious. I think we're having an internal debate about this, too, right now. Let's talk about two situations. I think the situation in which your appliances are destroyed because your buildings are destroyed, and I think that there probably is very little ability to salvage much of anything. I think the other issue is what we're facing here in Irma, where we were able to avoid structural damage to buildings, and so that the damage to our appliances really became damage to our refrigeration units and then the refrigerators that our tenants use because of just food spoilage. And I think that there would be some who would argue that you can salvage those units. You can clean them with a variety of bleach products and charcoal and other types of things to try to get the smell out. But the question, I think, sometimes becomes what's the most cost-effective method, depending upon whether you have, a handful of these or as in our case, 100 plus of these units. So it depends on the length. It depends on what's stored in the refrigerators. You begin to get, blood and other byproducts from meats and other things into drainage lines and systems. It becomes extremely difficult from a refrigerator. But there should be no expectation that damage from power situations would affect stoves and other types of things. One has to be careful in terms of air conditioning units, in terms of power coming back on. We're certainly hearing some stories, although we've been spared most, of people's air conditioners being subject to to a power surge as power came back on.
And it depends on the kind of appliance what we recommend with electrical is, and we're just kind of thinking about what's happening in Puerto Rico right now. If there's going to be an event of some kind of flood or any major climate event, it's always worth looking into taking your power systems offline so that there's no surge when the power comes back in. When it comes to electrical, you really don't want to make that call without a professional electrician to say this is something that's worth bringing back in or not, because there's corrosion. You need to clean out certain aspects of the appliance. It depends on the appliance, but it's electrical. You don't really want to DIY that. You want to make sure you have a professional looking at that. And also you want to make sure your insurance is in place and you've got that appliance documented and you know how much it cost and where to replace it before the event, because that's when you want to make a claim for your insurance. It's much better to be safer than sorry and replace that piece of equipment than use it, and make sure your insurance can cover that. That's the advice I would give.
All right. We have one comment, and that'll probably wrap us up for time. And the comment is, it's been suggested to store valuables in dishwashers. That saves valuables, but the appliance may be damaged for future use.
That's great information. We're taking all tips, and Steve's tips are going to start us off. We'd like to put together tips for rural communities at some point. As folks are going ahead with their emergency planning, there's a lot we could cover. We just touched the surface today, but we want to let you all know that we're here and we're ready to respond. We do have, before we close, an effort to support communities in the areas impacted by Harvey, Irma, and potentially Maria. We're going to be sending out a grant application on October 9th. So all of you out there who have been impacted by these storms, please think about signing up. If you need support and you need help, we're going to be available for you. So we'll send that out to you as soon as that comes out as well.
Very good. And I think, Laurie, we are at time. Do you have any final wrap-up words for us?
Well, Steve, we want to thank you for joining this call and, again, for your efforts. And we want to just encourage everyone to just pay close attention to the historical impacts at your communities and facilities, and stay connected. Stay connected and stay informed, and encourage community resilience as much as you can, because that's what gets us through these kind of events. We want to wish you all a safe September, which is National Preparedness Month, and a safe rest of the hurricane season. We're always available to chat about any of this, so thank you again for joining our discussion today.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you, Steve. And to our attendees, thank you for joining us for this live online event.
Thank you, Donna.
This ends today's session. Goodbye.